Thanks for tuning in. I am Pedro Gonzalez. This is the Shield Review podcast. I'm here with Ian Henderson, Eric Lendrum, and our special guest, Spencer Morrison. Spencer, I first came across your work when you fired off that well-articulated salvo at Ben Shapiro regarding his free trade dogma. But before we get into that, and I'm really looking forward to that, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journal, the National Economics Editorial.
Well, hi everyone. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. I'm very glad to be here. The National Economics Editorial is the website that I run. We tend to do stories about economic policy as regards to tariffs and immigration. That tends to be our focus. And I set up the editorial last year as a place, as basically a hub for the American School of Economics to congregate, because I found a big problem. Most of the websites, for example, the National Review and many of the other large conservative websites, they were all very pro-free trade. Mm-hmm. And obviously the president isn't, and many of the people who voted for him aren't. And they weren't getting a voice, so I set up the editorial to help lend a different voice to the conversation.
Right, and that's great. What's interesting, because I think you, before we started, you told us that you're actually from Canada?
Yes. Yeah, I am from Canada. I'm a law student. I have one more month to go. This is my 9th year of university, so I'm very happy to be done.
Well, congratulations.
Congrats.
Yeah, congratulations.
Very happy to be done.
What got you into the American school in terms of thought on trade?
Yeah, so it's actually a funny story. I was having so everybody that I know personally on campus, very pro free trade sort of people, and my research actually spawned from basically a desire to refute them. And like my background before I studied law, my background was in history, and the arguments they were making, I could never really find any analogous historical situation. In fact, most of the evidence that comes out through economic history is precisely the opposite of what free trade would suggest. So I started doing some research into the history of that. And even before that, I was very interested in economics after reading a book called The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, and he's a former stock trader. He's a very interesting guy, but his basic idea is that economists have no idea what they're doing. And I kind of latched onto that and did a lot of research into behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, and that basically led me here. And then Trump came around, of course, and then I thought, well, this might be our last chance here to bring some sense back into the economic policy debate, and I threw my hat in the ring, as it were.
That's great. We've been looking forward to this for a while, because since you threw your hat in the ring against Ben Shapiro, we've all been looking forward to talking to you about it, because I think we were all just really taken aback the way that you and I think this is something that you bill yourself on, is sort of mingling economics with history, and also some, I think, applied philosophy is what you call it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and that's such a great and refreshing approach, because, like you pointed out, a lot of this stuff only works in a box. Ian, did you have questions for me?
Sure. Kind of switching gears here. Thanks again, Spencer, for coming on. I wanted to kind of get really into policy. So, as we know, at the beginning of this year, President Donald Trump implemented a number of various different tariffs, starting mainly with appliances. So I think he placed a large tariff on like washing machines and other related appliances. Then the big one on aluminum and steel kicked in last month, and then he slapped on top of that $50 billion worth of tariffs on China, and now is contemplating adding an additional, I believe, $100 billion, correct me if I'm wrong, on top of that. He's reached out to Robert Lighthizer, our trade representative, to consider that new set of tariffs. So My question, my question to you regarding China's economic, I guess, neo-mercantilism. What is your take on the One Belt, One Road initiative that's being implemented by China, and how they're really reaching into third world developing countries on the African continent and Southeast Asia, and particularly in Latin America, and how through that One Belt, One Road initiative, is it economically threatening to national sovereignty, not only to those countries, but to us eventually?
That's a very interesting question that you brought up. I think there's multiple components to it. First, I think there's an economic component to it, and then there's also the obvious geopolitical ramifications of it. So let's talk first about the economic side of things. So what is the One Belt, One Road policy? Basically, China is investing in countries around China, and of course in Africa as well, but it's predominantly ones in China. And what they're doing is they're setting up large transportation networks, highways, high-speed rail lines, and freight railway lines, in addition to some digital infrastructure. But the basic point of it is to make all of the countries around China more strongly connected with China than they are to, say, America or Europe, which is their historical orientation. And economically speaking, there's a few things in that. First of all, China runs a very large trade surplus with the rest of the world, right? So what this does is it gives them a lot of foreign cash they have to invest and spend abroad. They don't import products from abroad, so what do? They buy up foreign assets and they buy up foreign debt. In terms of the belt, what they're doing is they're basically buying up foreign assets by investing abroad, with the intention of, one, gaining ownership in the foreign countries, and this gives them leverage, both economically and politically. And then second of all, it's going to make their export chains more efficient, right? Because transportation is a very vital part of improving productivity, economic productivity. It's going to basically make their exports more efficient. And then, of course, there's the political side of things, which is to orient those poor countries around China, as opposed to around America. And it's very important to remember that those countries were once part of China's sphere of influence. Basically, they're resurrecting their historical policy. So it's nothing new. We've seen it before. And it can be said that the last 500 years have been very different from the preceding 2,500.
Absolutely. And one thing I think many Americans seem to, I guess, fail to realize is the utilization of those economic gains by the Chinese and to build up their military capacity. And we've seen that with their dredging of sand from the bottom of the South China Sea to build man-made islands with military-grade facilities in those islands to gain control of one of the most important trade routes in the world, that being the Straits of Malacca, where 40% of world trade and about a third of the world oil goes through. And I think what we're doing by empowering China is funding their military. And they recently just opened a base in Djibouti at the Horn of Africa. And as you mentioned, by implementing these infrastructure projects, they're gaining access to gaining favor and gaining favorability and gaining political access to numerous developing countries. One example being them building a high-speed rail in Kenya from Mombasa to Nairobi and paying for 90% of the costs. And they're not doing that just to be nice.
No, of course not. There's a very good book. It came out pretty recently. It's called The Dictator's Handbook. Has anyone heard of that book before?
I have not.
No, okay. So this book, the basic idea in it, the thesis, is that politics is highly personable, right? It takes it back to that Machiavellian. There's a tendency in modern scholarship, political science, and basically any study is to look at the aggregate, right? But politics is very, very personal. you only have to bribe one person or the right demographic, and you can basically take control of a country. And it's especially important to remember that in the context of Africa, for example, the people that you need to basically pay off and buy off to gain control, there's not that many of them. So when China is building, for example, that high-speed rail line, what they're doing is they're providing jobs for like a friendly dictator, right? And of course, American foreign policy is no stranger to this. And I think we need to recognize that this is exactly what China is doing. They're buying influence in Africa because they need the raw materials.
Absolutely. And I guess one last question before we move on to Eric's questioning. Pretty simple, but I guess your answer might be a little bit more complex. Is what are your policy recommendations to taking on China and preventing them from becoming the next economic and military world power? What should we do? What should President Trump do to prevent that?
You know, it's a very simple question. The problem is that simple questions never have a simple answer, do they? So there's a few problems. And the first one is, I think the premise of your question is basically flawed, because it presumes that there's something that we can do to stop China's rise. The problem is that China has already risen. If you look at their GDP in terms of purchasing power parity, that is what they can buy for every dollar, right? It's actually significantly larger than America's economy today. And then there's the second issue to that, is that China's economy is heavily tilted towards primary and secondary industry, as opposed to service industries, which is the tertiary sector. And this is very, very important. When you look at America's economy, it has one of the largest service industries as a proportion of the economy in the world, right? The issue with that is that services generally don't produce any meaningful wealth. And they do, but it's a different sort of wealth, right? There's a very profound difference between producing, say, oil or a chair or a tank and producing like a massage or tax returns, right? So there's a large section of the service economy which is profoundly overvalued if you're looking at what is considered a useful economy in terms of, for example, military production, if we're looking at it in geopolitical terms. And that's one of the big issues. And I'll give you a good example, because a lot of people say, they don't know what I'm talking about here, right? I'll give you a concrete example. Okay. America spends roughly $500 billion filing taxes. They do that every year. That $500 billion spent filing taxes is calculated as a portion of the GDP, right? That didn't produce any wealth, and I think we can all agree that filing taxes doesn't make anybody actually richer. It's an issue in redistribution, but that's counted towards GDP, right? So when you think about that and you say, okay, well, we spent $500 billion, that's like what, 3% of our GDP? That's gone. That's evaporated, right? And to a certain degree, other countries do the same thing. But the problem is that when you're comparing the GDPs of China or the GDP of America, accountants, tax lawyers, they make an enormous amount of money, and that all goes in America, and that all goes into GDP. In China, they don't. That's one of the reasons that America's economy is so large, is because it's an inflation of value with regard to the service sector. And a lot of people don't know that. So when we're looking at China's rise, they already have a significantly larger economy than we do. And here's a second concrete example. In the last 10 years, China has erected more skyscrapers than America has in the last century. That's real wealth.
Wow.
And that's a sobering thought, isn't it?
It is.
That's a sobering thought. That's real wealth. They've erected more cities out from scratch than there are people in the Western world, right? And you think to yourself, to what degree is our economy actually geared towards something productive that we could use in the event of a conflict? And the problem is that it's not much. It's a very small fraction of our economy that actually generates meaningful material wealth.
Yeah. And on that, I'm sorry, now that you answered that, I had one additional question.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Timothy Beardson. He's commented on Chinese population growth, and he, through his research and studies, said that due to the implementation of the one-child policy that was implemented by Deng Xiaoping in 1978 to, I guess, curb the overpopulation of the Han ethnic group. Because of that, the Chinese population is going to peak in 2030. And then following that, it's going to start to decrease significantly. And I believe his estimates were that China's population would, by the end of the century, decrease by a third by 2100, and that was a conservative estimate. Other estimates have said that it will decrease by a half, because the one-child policy has led to numerous families choosing to have males over females to continue the family lineage.
Absolutely.
And because of that, there's about, for every 6 men, there's only 5 women in the country. And that's with a 1.4 billion population.
And that's concentrated at certain demographics, too. Right?
Yes.
I think at the peak demographic, it's something like 136 men for every 100 women. Like,
yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah.
And do you think that once that kicks in after 2030, don't you think that that'll have huge economic ramifications to China's growth as a global power?
You know, it's an interesting question. And I've had this debate before. My thoughts on it are pretty much as follows. First, there's no question that China is going to be having a demographic crunch. They have an aging population, and that population is skewed towards men, as you know. And their birth rate has fallen significantly because of the disparity between how many men and women there are at certain demographics. And that's going to cause some problems. But I don't think they're problems that are insurmountable. And the reason for that is that China's economic growth, as of maybe about 10 years ago, is not predicated upon an expanding population. In fact, the expanding population in many ways has been a hindrance to China's economic growth. China has been one of the countries, one of the only developing countries that has successfully embraced widespread automation, to the point where a Chinese factory is almost as efficient as an American factory in the goods that both of us produce. So the issue there is that they can basically produce. They have the population, is basically what I'm trying to say. Their growth is not contingent upon population expansion. So I don't see there being a problem. And a really good example of a country that's coping well with a contracting population is Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the news, you always hear political pundits say Japan has a lot of problems because of its aging population, right? And they say, oh, but we don't want to be like Japan. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Exactly. I've written about this, actually.
Yeah. So they always say that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that they're not looking at the nuance of it. If you look at GDP per capita in Japan, so that is how much wealth the country is producing per person, it's actually been rising at a faster rate than America's, despite their contracting population, right? So what that tells me, and what it should tell everybody else, is that economic growth has really nothing to do with population. It's about productivity, and it's about technological advancement. And that's what many economists don't seem to understand, right? So so when we're looking at Japan, their economy has been roughly stagnant in terms of absolute output, but per person output has been increasing. So they actually haven't had a problem with economic growth. It's actually it's a falsehood that the media perpetuates, mainly to further their agendas when it comes to immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And China will probably be in the same boat, except for it's obviously a much larger boat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that answered all my questions for now, I guess. Eric, did you want to go ahead with your line of questioning?
Yes, I did. Thank you very much, Ian. So, of course, my line of questioning primarily relates to something that Pedro hinted at the beginning, which, of course, is the fact that in addition to your work, Spencer, at the National Economics Editorial, you're also a contributor for American Greatness, where Pedro and I are also contributors. And in particular, of course, quite a few of those articles have been on the subject of trade. And one big recent one you did, truly one of the best, was on March 14th, which is called Why Ben Shapiro is Wrong on Free Trade. That title, of course, just about says it all. You made, of course, a great argument for trade, for protectionism and tariffs. You cited a number of studies, used some great allegories and comparisons, you cited some historical examples, and through it all, it wasn't just an argument for tariffs, it was also taking direct shots at one of the biggest stars in quote-unquote American conservatism. In other words, he's basically the figurehead of the National Review crowd, if you will. And although he spends plenty of time on social media going after or responding to like leftist criticism or maybe crazy attacks on him from the alt-right, he very rarely responds to intelligent, highly researched and well-articulated responses from fellow right-wingers, on such issues like this. But this time he did. He actually responded to your article with a very eloquently titled piece on Daily Wire called "Yes, Tariffs Are Still Stupid. Here's Why," which just reflected, of course, the contrast in maturity and professionalism, or lack thereof, as in his case is telling. But not just an article, he also devoted time on his highly viewed and highly listened to podcast, which just goes to show how much your article really got to him. And
about 15 minutes of it was dedicated to him. Yeah,
exactly. That's plenty of time for each episode. And then, of course, you wrote a second article called 5 days later on March 19th called "Yes, Ben Shapiro is Still Wrong on Tariffs. Here's Why." So, first off, could you give us an overall summary of that back and forth? Your original argument, his response, and what was wrong in his responses, and then your subsequent response to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a brief history of the debate, as it were.
All right.
So, my original article was responding to something that Ben Shapiro posted on his Facebook page. It was a 3-minute video that was meant to be a viral video on him debunking tariffs. Mm-hmm. And I watched the video, and I was quite taken aback. It did not debunk tariffs in the slightest. I thought it was actually quite bad. And the reason for that is he made a number of factual errors in it. So my original article, my purpose in it was to A, outline his errors that he made, and then B, present a comprehensive case for why tariffs are the way to go in terms of economic policy. Mm-hmm. And just on the specifics. So in his video, Ben Shapiro said that, well, he gave an example. He said that countries like Canada, Britain, and America run very large trade deficits. That is, they purchase more from foreigners than they sell them. And he said that those countries were consequently some of the richest countries on earth. So clearly trade deficits can't be that bad. The problem is that was nothing but a sophistry. The countries that he failed to mention were countries like Oman, like Brazil, like Iran. They're just really, basically the 3 countries he held up as examples were the only 3 in the top 20 that were developed nations. Every other country on that list was relatively poor. And then on the other side, he did the exact opposite. He said that countries that run trade surpluses tend to be poorer than countries, obviously, that run trade deficits. And the problem there is that he mentioned only one example. He mentioned Iran. Sorry, I got that one wrong originally. He mentioned Iran. But look at the countries he missed out. He didn't mention Germany, Japan. He didn't mention the Netherlands, Israel, Singapore, Switzerland, or Sweden. Pretty much, those are all highly developed, rich countries, right? Mm-hmm. So he's basically lying to his audience by omission, and it comes down to the basic aphorism: what you see is all there is, right? When he presents you with something, it's important to look at what he's not presenting, because that can tell the whole story. Yeah. So I called that out, and I think that really got under his skin.
Okay, so then that was the initial video that you responded to, And then in the second the article he wrote, calling tariffs stupid because nothing says solid argument like using the word stupid in your title. What was? Can you summarize what his extremely awful rebuttal was to your article?
Yeah. Okay. So his rebuttal was basically tackling the thesis in my first article, which was that economic growth is what's called path dependent. That is, if you have an industry, say for example, and in it I gave an example, a historical example, using pottery. Right. If you have a pottery industry, then you're on the path to potentially inventing like the pottery wheel or the flywheel. However, if you don't have those technologies and you have, say, some other technology, you're not going to be able to ever invent the secondary and tertiary, more advanced technologies, right? And economic growth is basically a predicate of technological growth. And that's the big issue there. So he basically fired back at that, and he said, oh, well, path dependency isn't a real thing. And he cited a book which was a case study of Microsoft that didn't really deal with path dependency in an international context. I'm fairly sure he Googled I think he Googled path dependency and then cited basically the first book he could find. If he had actually read that book if he actually read the book, it doesn't say what he thinks it says.
Right.
And then I basically ended up trying to debunk a few of the big stereotypical arguments that free traders often make, right? Mm-hmm. For example, the Milton Friedman secretary analogy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think pretty much everybody is familiar with this one. But let me just really quickly. So Milton Friedman is famous for saying, basically explaining free trade and comparative advantage with the following example. He says that you have a lawyer and you have a secretary. The lawyer is better at both typing and doing legal research than is the secretary. However, the secretary is comparatively better at typing than she is at legal research. Likewise, a lawyer is comparatively better at doing research than he is at typing. So it makes sense for both of them to specialize. The lawyer does the legal research, and the secretary does the typing. And then by trading their labor, both of them are made richer. And that's how Milton Friedman explains comparative advantage, and that's how Ben Shapiro on his show explained comparative advantage, except for he used something on the Ben Shapiro show or whatever. Yeah. The issue there that has been noted by developmental economists is that if you're, for example, the secretary, you got to think outside the box if you really want to get rich. Is it best to be the best secretary, or is it best to go back to law school and become a lawyer? Even the worst lawyer makes more money than the best secretary. And that's basically the point in international trade when it comes to industries. It's better to have a small slice of a cutting-edge advanced industry than it is to have a very large share of a dead-end industry. And the example I brought up was, would you rather have silicone conductors as an industry, or would you rather grow soybeans? And I think the answer to that is very obvious. You want to be producing silicone conductors. You don't want to be producing soybeans.
Yeah, no, definitely. I remember seeing that and just thinking that some of the claims he made just outright were terrible. Like, for example, he tried to claim, well, you can't know which industries are going to be successful. You can't predict which industries are going to be economically successful. And I looked at that and I'm like, well, I mean...
That's nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, speculation is a huge part of the economy. That's the whole idea behind stocks, right? It's all about speculation and guessing which companies, which stocks, which industries are going to do well. So just overall, it was very strange. And I think you made a very good point in your original piece, citing, I believe it was Isaac Newton, who lost his wealth in a great crash, even though he was obviously a brilliant scientist. And you use that to draw a comparison to Shapiro, who you say, I mean, obviously... he graduated from Harvard, top of his class in constitutional law. He's obviously very educated in terms of the Constitution, and he uses that and applies that to social policy, and of course, applies that very well to his socially conservative stances. But that doesn't make him an economist, which that really kind of opened my eyes. Like, it's so simple, but it's so true at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah, knowledge is often domain specific. Somebody like Isaac Newton knows an awful lot about mathematics. I mean, the guy invented calculus. Yeah. But when he was trying to invest, he lost his entire fortune. right? And you see that all the time, is that some people, and university professors are the case in point, right? You get a professor who knows an awful lot about, say, microbiology, but the guy can barely buy his own groceries because he's that incompetent when it comes to just daily life, right?
Yeah.
And that's pretty much Ben Shapiro, right? The guy knows
So
guy knows an awful lot about law.
Mm-hmm.
I think he may know less than he thinks he knows, but I think he knows an awful lot more than the average person about law. But that doesn't make him a genius when it comes to economics. In fact, he knows very little. And that was the point of that article, was to outline in precise terms the limits of his knowledge. And it actually comes back, and this is probably one of the best points that I could have possibly made, is that in David Ricardo's piece, The Political Economy and Taxation, or whatever it is, right? It's got a long title.
Uh-huh.
In his piece, in chapter 7, paragraphs 18 and 19, David Ricardo acknowledges that the theory of comparative advantage is domain specific. That is, it only applies when certain conditions are met, right?
Mm-hmm.
And most people who study economics don't know this because they never read the original source material. And Ben Shapiro didn't either. And it was very, very obvious that he didn't read the source material. And you have to do that. And it's sad that most people don't.
Yeah, it really is. And looking at this whole exchange, again, it was very extraordinary to see him responding to any, really, again, well-researched criticism against him from a fellow conservative, from someone else on the right. Because this is something I noticed. You mentioned before we started recording, Spencer, that you did reach out to him. You said you sent him an email, and you also publicly reached out to him on Twitter, but for a possible debate, to discuss these ideas further. But as of the recording of this podcast at least, he has not responded to any of those invitations to debate, which is really especially interesting because for the longest time, of course, Shapiro has built himself up as this master debater, right? He is supposedly like the best debater that the American right has. He's still pretty young. He is admittedly very articulate. He's always got like really sharp wit. He's great at throwing insults at whatever 19-year-old blue-haired transgender college student is asking him a question at a college speech Q&A.
Exactly, yeah.
But
he spends his time debating college kids. He doesn't debate actual intellectuals or academics, generally speaking.
Exactly.
And that's why I was not surprised when I got no response.
Yeah.
So that's a good segue into a question that, because I obviously there's a bone to pick with Ben Shapiro, and not necessarily because of who he is, but the way that he doesn't regard people as intellectual equals. I mean, you can see that in the way that he responded to Morrison's article. There's a degree of like, you're beneath me, and so I'm going to talk to you like that. So, but more importantly, this is part of the bigger conversation of how do we change the way that we talk about trade and economics, because one of the problems now is that there's more than one Ben Shapiro, and they sort of have call it a hegemony on the right wing conversation over economics, and that's Shapiro's maybe the biggest head of a multi, we'll call it a hydra. He's one part of the problem, and I guess the real question is, how do we change the way we have this conversation? And I think, answering my own question, one of the easiest ways to do it, one of the most called direct ways to do it, would be to for people like Spencer Morrison to debate Ben Shapiro. But until Ben Shapiro agrees to that, I guess we're kind of stuck where we are now, or we have these discussions of our podcast and publish. But what are your thoughts on this, Spencer? I guess shaking up the discussion and breaking into it when people like Spencer, like people like Ben, don't want to let other right wingers, come onto the turf.
Yeah, and you really hit the nail on the head there. It's a very big problem, and I actually don't blame Ben Shapiro in the slightest for not wanting to debate me. Right. There's only downside potential in debating me when it comes to him, right? And you look at it this way: most of the people at the top in the conservative media hierarchy are free traders, right? So that means anybody at the top, if they wanted to debate an American school economist or a protectionist, they would necessarily be debating down to somebody smaller, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's a fundamental rule that you never take an asymmetrical bet where you have more downside potential than you have upside. And Ben Shapiro can't gain from defeating me in a debate because I don't bring any audience to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? And, if he comes into a debate and say, for example, he wins, and it's like, oh, great, he beat Spencer Morrison, who's basically a nobody, right?
Right.
But if he loses the debate, everybody says, oh, well, maybe Ben Shapiro is not as smart as we all thought he was, right?
Exactly.
So there's no case where he wins that, so there's no reason for him to take it. And the same thing doesn't just apply to him; it applies to everybody else at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. So it's a really difficult thing to do because nobody is going to take basically a lose-lose situation, right?
No Ben Shapiro out there is going to allow you to basically carbonize the very shiny idol they've made of themselves for their 2-3 million listener following. And
it makes no sense to them. It makes no sense for them to do so either. So I can't blame them. It's totally rational.
So I guess that brings us back to my question: is how do we disrupt that? Like, that's what would you? I mean, you started your own forum, the National Economics Editorial, and you write for American Greatness, and I know the AG is giving you some really good reach. But is that the best we can do for now, or should the right course of action would be to agitate for people like Ben Shapiro to engage other right wingers? Because if I can compare your school of thought to somebody, it's very Buchananite. When you talk about combining philosophy with history with economics, automatically I think of Pat Buchanan. I don't know if you're a fan of him. I am. But like you, the way he debates is he uses facts. Ben's whole spiel is facts don't care about your feelings. The problem is he often cherry picks the facts, right?
Yeah.
That's what I said. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, without getting off into a tangent, would you think that would be the best course of action? Would be to prod the Shapiros to say, hey, listen, we're right wing too, and if we're supposedly all in this together, you need to let me voice my ideas by debating you, because that's without getting a little bit too romantic, that's how this nation was founded, right? It's a nation founded on the debate of ideas by people who were all on the same side.
There are 2 points that I'd like to make there, and I think there's 2 courses of action that I think could yield some positive results. The first one is to recognize that what we're saying is actually correct, and trying to get connected to the actual people directly, I think that's a very effective means of doing it, because the fact is that millions of people have lost their jobs. Since 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, America lost 5 million manufacturing jobs, and on top of that, roughly 7 million predicate jobs that basically depended upon money being brought into the region through manufacturing, right? So we lost about 12 million jobs in the space of a decade. All of those people know exactly why they lost their jobs, but nobody is articulating it. If we can reach those people, I mean, they know we're right, and there's no way that we can lose, basically. The problem is reaching the people. And that's why I think websites like American Greatness and then my own website are a valuable resource for that. Number 2, you brought up agitation. I think that's a very, very important means of actually bringing people to the table. And here's the deal. You can be as scholarly as you like, and you can be as nice and polite as you like. But unless you tick somebody off, they're not going to debate you. And that's why in my article, I went out of my way to prod Ben Shapiro and to appeal to it. Yeah, I went out of my way to do that. And what I did is
which book he Googled. I'm still really impressed by how you figured out which book he Googled, by the way.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I have my colleague Ian Fletcher. He's an economist. He wrote the book "Free Trade Doesn't Work." I was actually corresponding with him before I wrote my response, and I have to give him credit for that one.
Thanks. Yeah, that's good.
Special operation.
Yeah, I have to give him credit for that one.
Go on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So getting back to the point of agitation. The thing is that I mentioned before that people at the top, there's only downside when they debate people with smaller audiences, right? But there's a corollary to that, and that corollary is called hubris. People at the top tend to start believing their own BS at a certain point, right? and this is this is not Ben Shapiro specifically. It's anybody who meets with success after success after success. Eventually, they bite off more than they can chew, and they begin to they want to fight as well, right? And a good example of this is looking back to history, when the Persian Emperor Xerxes, when he went and invaded Greece, he had the sea whipped and he sunk shackles into it because he thought he was greater than the sea. That's hubris. Ben Shapiro, in the same way, is also hubristic. So when he saw my argument, he thought to himself, it'll be easy for me to win because, he's never been really challenged on these points. And obviously, I think, like the Persian emperor, he may have bit off more than he could chew. But that's something that happens, right? So when you call people out at the top, oftentimes they don't know what they don't know.
Right? Exactly. Yeah. They think that they look at you, and as you said earlier, Ben Shapiro probably looked at you and said, "Oh, who's this Spencer Morrison guy? He's a nobody. I should easily win." But then when he wrote their second response, then he probably, or whoever his little his henchman over the Daily Wire who monitors your articles saw it, was probably thinking, "Oh boy, this guy is actually serious. This guy knows what he's talking about." And that brings me back to a point I was making earlier: is that Shapiro and others in this, I guess you can call it like the National Review crowd, or basically just neocons. That's basically what they are, neoconservatives. They rose to dominance in the American right by suppressing other right-wingers. By back in the day, it was paleocons that they all forced out of the movement. Pretty much since they first started rising in the 60s and gaining institutional power. And it's pretty clear that neocons have lost the popular support in the Republican Party. They're definitely on the decline in the Republican Party, but they're still prominent in media, whether it's some over at Fox News or, again, the National Review, Shapiro, Goldberg, French, Lowry, that whole wonderful motley crew they have over there. As in the media, you're seeing this new resurgence of what some people call the new right, or the third new right at least, what I like to call the neo-right, which again is paleocons, protectionists, nationalists. They're all starting to rise on alternative platforms and whatnot. But even as the neocons continue to lose their influence, they still remain just so stubbornly committed to these ideas, even as wrong as they are. And I'm looking on this issue of trade, free trade versus protectionism. I have to wonder, and I wanted your opinion on this, Spencer, or your theory at least. Why do you think the neocon National Review crowd just loves free trade so much and just worships it and idolizes it the way they do?
When I was doing research for my book, it's called America Betrayed, I was trying to figure out an answer to this precise question. Why did the Republican Party abandon its historic position? Now, the Republican Party, it's worth noting, was founded on basically two principles. Slavery is wrong, and tariffs are good.
Yes.
It was a populist party. That was the whole platform, right? So you have guys like Theodore Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln. They instituted very large tariffs. They were big supporters of it, right? And those are some of the seminal figures in American history and key figures in the Republican Party. They're big protectionists, right? And this dates all the way back to George Washington. The second act that George Washington signed was the Tariff Act of 1789. And that was based on Alexander Hamilton's recommendation that America must industrialize. And we can't let our markets be flooded by cheap British manufactured products. And it was a good thing they did that, because that set the stage for the industrialization of the North, and it allowed them to pull ahead economically of the free trading South. Right? It is because of tariffs that the North was able to win the Civil War.
Yeah.
And it was because of tariffs that America was able to industrialize and win World War I and World War II. Tariffs protect not only American industry, but American industry protects America's freedom. You can never separate economics and politics, and that's something that the neocons, I don't think they really understand. Now, to get back to I went off on a bit of a tangent, so please forgive me, but to get back to your initial question, why are neocons so stubborn? To understand that, we have to understand why free trade was embraced in the first place. So after America and Britain won World War II, the world was polarized between basically the American sphere of influence and the Soviet sphere of influence. And both of them offered, at the time, what seemed like good competing ideologies, right? And in retrospect, obviously, Soviet communism was a complete and abject failure. But at the time, it was very difficult for people, especially people in developing third world countries. They didn't know which one to pick, right? They both looked promising. So what the Americans did was open their markets. We lowered our tariffs, and we included a lot of countries. We excluded a lot of countries from export bans. So we were allowed to export technology to them that hitherto we were not allowed to do. What this did is it provided a very valuable incentive for third world countries to join the American sphere, right? Because what we were basically doing was industrializing them and allowing them to sell their goods in American markets. It made them richer at our expense. However, the American government decided that that was a necessary step to defeat the Soviets and bring more allies onto our side, right? Free trade was never about economics. Free trade was about politics, and then it was post hoc justified by economists. That's very important to remember.
Wow, call me mind blown. That is, I never thought of it that way, but that makes so much sense. That actually reminds me of something that Pedro has written on a number of occasions. Really, some of his best work is talking about the failure of the conservative libertarian alliance, and that too was born out of the Cold War. Pretty much the main reason that conservatives accepted libertarians, who in some ways are kind of like the socialists of the right, is because, oh, hey, you hate communism, we hate communism, we're friends. It's the same logic we use to, fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which that turned out great, right? That really, it's so simple, but once again, it makes so much sense. That literally, that communism, which of course as evil as it was, and the terror of the Cold War for the longest time, that would be pretty much the one thing that would make us forget centuries of history, especially when, I think, as you put it, protectionism is how we went from an agricultural power to an industrial, global hegemon in roughly half a century. Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing is here, I don't know if you guys are aware of this. The Cold War is over.
Yeah.
There is no Soviet Union. We don't need free trade. It doesn't we can return to the policies that worked beforehand. And neocons don't get this. That's why they're so interventionist when it comes to foreign policy. They think they basically think they're fighting the Red Menace. The Red Menace is dead.
Yeah.
China's not even communist anymore.
No.
We won, right? So we now have to start looking in terms of, we have to reorient the way we look at the world. It's no longer a bipolar world. It's a great powers world. It's about maintaining a balance of power. And it's about making sure that America's economy is strong, not to support our allies, but, to be strong for the sake of the American people. And that's very important. And I would like to make one other point. Most American economists and American politicians at the time knew that free trade wasn't going to make Americans richer. And the reason they knew this is because we have already tried free trade once before. In the 1840s, Great Britain began embracing what I would call a radical new theory. That is the theory of comparative advantage and international liberalism, economic liberalism, free trade, right? It was an abject and complete failure for Great Britain. Not only did unemployment increase in Britain, but the British market was flooded by cheap German and, ironically, American goods that was outcompeting British manufacturers. Well, why is that? Because there was a trade asymmetry. The British were having a very difficult time selling goods in Germany and in America. However, Germans and Americans could sell goods in Britain. This gave them an advantage of economies of scale, which allowed them to drop their prices relative to British producers, and British producers basically fell behind. Not only that, but British investment went abroad. There's a good way of looking at the economy is like a hydraulic system, right? Mm-hmm. Money is a lot like water. It always flows to the lowest possible point. People buy cheap goods, people want to hire cheap labor, and people look for cheap investments. So if you have the high ground, if you have an advanced, developed economy where labor is expensive, for example, what you're going to do is you're going to invest in cheaper jurisdictions. And that's what happened in Britain in the late Victorian period. They had what's called capital flight, where massive amounts of money were invested abroad in places like Argentina, Africa, Canada, building industry abroad, but not being reinvested in Britain. So Britain basically had a capital investment drought, which cost them dearly, and it actually allowed Germany and America to catch up economically. And that's what's happening right now in America, right? We're offshoring our industries abroad. We're investing abroad, but we're not reinvesting that wealth in America. So what happens is that American industries suffer, they can't buy new capital equipment because they don't have that investment, right? So we slowly begin to fall behind. And it's interesting that von Mises, he's the paramount Austrian economist. Mm-hmm. In one of his early works, what he actually said is that what made America rich was that America invested in capital. And the American workers had the most capital equipment per person. Well, do you know why that is? It's because of tariffs. It forced American businessmen and capital owners to invest in American productivity, right?
Yeah.
Von Mises recognized that. And, he's allegedly the biggest free trader of them all. I mean, everybody knows that. It's not up for debate.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's related. It reminds me of this speech that Karl Marx gave in Brussels. Mm-hmm. It's just really, drawn out. It's really, how he talks. He repeats himself constantly. But he concludes towards the end.
There's all the opium.
Right. Yeah. And the starvation. No. He concludes that protectionism is. He says it's the conservative policy of our time, and he hates protectionism because he says that it builds nations up because it allows it encourages nations and it enables them to retain capital, which only builds industry, which of course he sees as a negative because more capital, more industry, the bourgeois gets stronger, and he very clearly articulates this. Protectionism, it fortifies industry, and then he says that fortifying industry will lead to dependency on global markets and all this other stuff that really he kind of goes off on a tangent again. But then he comes back and says, so from my point, I support free trade because it will be the end of nations, of sovereignty, and it will accelerate this this inequality between the at the time the working class and the middle class. It was very prescient. I mean, obviously things are different and the environment is different, but what he said wasn't necessarily wrong, at least in the way he saw free trade as a form of economic Marxism.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I think it can't be stressed enough. Karl Marx was a free trader. And as you articulated, the reason for him supporting free trade was that he thought that it would collapse the price of labor in Germany if they were to start investing in, for example, Poland, right? And what that would do is it would impoverish the German proletariat and encourage them to revolt, right? And he correctly identified the fact that what free trade does is it basically normalizes prices, not just in goods but also in labor across the world, right? And that's a very big problem. Is if you're in a higher labor jurisdiction, the cost of labor in your country will go down because of offshoring. But that hurts most people in your country who are, obviously laborers or workers. That's the issue. And that's why free trade that's why Karl Marx supported free trade, and it goes back to the hydrological understanding of the economy, right? Tariffs are the dam that keeps the water, the investment in your country.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, it's going to be flowing into China or Brazil.
Exactly. Sorry, did you?
Oh, yeah, I was going to interject. I think, kind of, it's a connected topic, but sort of switching gears. I think that one thing that we point out that the Democrats and liberals seem to forget is flyover country and blue collar working class Americans, but also the business class Republicans have forgotten those people as well. And many of the college Republican types have no connection to steel workers and coal miners and oil rig workers and farmers, and they don't understand or really can conceive the needs and issues that those individuals have. And it was Donald Trump that managed to win over what was considered safe, blue Democrat territory, Union country. And I firmly believe that it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for any of the Mitt Romney or John Kasich type conservatives to win over those voters, because they never spoke out for the needs or desires for the American working class, which isn't. It's not. And the second that you bring that up, the neocon types or the free trade types consider it almost communistic
socialism
to defend or try to look out for the interests of the blue collar working class Americans.
Yeah, that. I have 2 points. I have 2 things I want to respond to, if that's all right.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So the first point is that in my own life, I get that. I totally empathize with just the regular person, and I go to university. Basically, everybody at that university who's studying law, the vast majority of them are from fairly rich backgrounds. A lot of them have lawyers as parents. Neither of my parents went to college. To pay for school, I worked in a gravel yard in the boulder pit, moving around boulders, basically, right? The people in the university, the people who end up becoming the college Republican type people, they can't even understand that. They have no idea that type of experience that I had and that millions of other American, Canadian people have, right? That's the blue collar life, and people just don't understand that because they're so far removed, right?
Yeah.
Can you imagine, for example, Bill Clinton working in a boulder pit? I can't.
Nope.
Can you imagine Barack Obama doing that? No, of course not.
Right?
They don't understand the problems of regular people and they don't care about them, and that's why they don't care about protecting just regular workers.
Yeah.
And the second point I'd like to make, and I completely agree with you. Mitt Romney would not have won the last election. Donald Trump won the last election, I think, because he was able to bring over a lot of people in the swing states in the Midwest, in that Rust Belt region, that have lost their jobs. He won because of those people. And that's an important fact that we have to reconcile with. And then responding to the fact that neocons often say that it's somehow socialistic to look out for your fellow American, I would point out the fact, and this is a fact I made precisely in my article that I was responding to Ben Shapiro in. I said that tariffs are the form of taxation most consistent with small government. And the reasons for that are, first of all, tariffs are a completely avoidable tax. If you don't want to pay them, buy American. It's that simple. You can't opt out of sales taxes or income tax, right? But you can opt out of tariffs, and that's the best part about tariffs, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And the second part is that what tariffs do is they basically they increase artificially the demand for American labor. That is, they increase wages and they increase job opportunities. Well, I'll tell you what, people who are making good livings, they don't vote for socialist governments. You know who votes for socialist governments? people that have lost their jobs to China. That's who votes for socialist governments.
Exactly.
And it's no mystery why the Rust Belt states all turned blue after free trade. Well, it's because they're the ones that lost their jobs. And then, well, what happens when they lose their jobs? They vote Democrat. And then what do the Democrats do? They increase taxes and they increase regulations. And then this basically, it undoes all of the so-called gains that you got from free trade anyways, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. You say, oh, we'll get some cheap goods from China. But now, to support the people who lost their jobs, we'll be, instituting XYZ social welfare programs. We're going to increase these regulations and taxes. And, oh, you're going to get Democratic presidents half the time. Yeah. Honestly, if free traders would just think in just realpolitik terms, mm-hmm. they would see that the political ramifications completely undid any of the so-called gains that free trade would have gotten them anyways. And that's just that's when reality meets theory. That's when business meets economics.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think we're getting towards the end now, mm-hmm. but this comes back to, again, changing the way that we have this discussion. I think with Paul Ryan stepping down, there's a lot of doomsaying, a lot of concern. I don't know. I think that there should be maybe some optimism or some hope that we can change the way the Republican Party, or at least, I guess, change the rhetoric or point it in a different direction. Because, like Ian said, right now it's very much business class centered. And Paul Ryan's like an embodiment of that. He's a guy. He's a guy that supposedly gives a copy of Atlas Shrugged to everyone who works for him. He worships free trade, and I think that maybe there's a chance for us now that someone like Paul Ryan's stepping down. Maybe there's a chance for us to ask for like a different Republican Party, or at least different kind of leadership that, like Ian was saying, that reaches out to the people. Ian and I actually attended a conference with Hugh Hewitt, Larry Elder, and Sebastian Gorka recently, and that's something that Hugh Hewitt was saying is that I think in Trumbull, Ohio, I don't know if that's the name of the town. It's close enough, but he was saying that it's a deeply democratic town, working class, lots of Catholics, and he said that for Clinton and for Obama, they turned out 50-60%. He said they turned out 55% for Trump, and he said that's unheard of. That no one ever thought that a Republican could get they could get that part of Ohio, let alone 55% of the vote there. So I think this comes back to us agitating for different rhetoric from the Republican Party, and maybe it begins with tackling the Ben Shapiros who sort of dominate the market right now on this discussion, because it's like we're kind of getting at the point is that this is sort of suicidal. Like free trade, the end game of free trade is that, America no longer resembles America, mm-hmm. and it loses its economic sovereignty. It loses its ability to defend itself in time of war. We lose the capacity to produce what we need. I think Pat Buchanan said that the Founding Fathers are very much concerned with the United States explicitly having the ability to produce what it needs in time of war and in time of peril. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I thought you'd find this interesting, Spencer. After you schooled Shapiro on Ricardo and said, "Listen, one of the things that Ricardo talks about and that you clearly missed is the immobility of capital." Mm-hmm. And I went out, and so I was like, "Okay, I got to find like a contemporary example of this, right? Something that's happening right now." And I found one in Silicon Valley. This journal called Pando, and it's like an independent publication that's based out of Silicon Valley. It covers Silicon Valley news. I found this interesting article. Basically, it attributes Silicon Valley's success not to the giant, reptilian brains of Mark Zuckerberg, but it attributes it to the fact that Silicon Valley is very unique for all of its, liberal cosmopolitan rhetoric. Venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, they invest all of their capital in Silicon Valley. Like it only until very, very recently did they start investing capital overseas. At least seriously. And this journalist says, like if you look at this, like Silicon Valley is proof of what people are missing in terms of comparative advantage. That it has been successful not because everyone there has a huge brain and like an IQ of 250. It's because they've been keeping their capital in a little 30-mile radius.
Exactly.
It's really interesting. It confirmed it, and well, at least for me, I don't know. I got into some debates with people who follow Ben Shapiro after your articles came out, and I had to tell you, and I made this point to Ian and Eric, that if liberals brainwash students on the basis of quality, then it could be said that what Shapiro and company are doing with this free trade deal, it's a different type of brainwashing on the basis of what I guess principles. That it's part of the Republican conservative principle to worship free trade, to venerate free trade. And you see that, like, this is, again, comes back to how do we change the discussion, or that we need to, I should say, because a lot of the following that Ben Shapiro's created, they almost literally physically project information that contradicts what they've been taught about free trade. Like it's almost like a deep, like a triggering, if you will. Like it's a very almost emotional response. Like you're attacking not just like free trade, but like I don't know, some aspect of Americanism or what they think is Americanism. It's really peculiar, and I see it in a lot of his following, and it's a problem. So I guess that's more reason for people like Spencer and I guess us who are a little bit beneath Spencer in terms of economic knowings, but there's definitely a lot of work to do, and we have to shake up the way that this conversation's had.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest problems is, like Spencer pointed out, is that Shapiro and company are literally dumbing down the conversation. These like stupid, because that's what it is. I'm sorry, it's the little like the secretary example. Like it's like I'm gonna debunk this theory and all of history in 2 minutes flat. Like that's so dumb. Really, it's like I'm gonna debunk tariffs in 2 minutes, and he just like cherry picks a bunch of facts. Done. It's a really horrible way to have this discussion. I think. Do you know who it was who called, I guess, the fusion of like history, philosophy, and economics? They called it a dismal science. Do you know who this was? Quote is in my head, but I can't think of the name. But
I can't remember.
But I think his whole thing was we need to make we need to basically make economics easier to understand, and by that it meant take out all of the other history and stuff like that, and the the societal impact, which I don't want to talk all night here, but and you do this very well. One of I think the best counters to this whole free trade is great because TVs are cheaper than they've ever been. I can buy a sofa from IKEA for less than I could 20 years ago. Therefore, free trade's great. It's like, okay, well, let's look at what's happening when we offshore jobs, when we accelerate the process of automation, right? When we say that automation is not just inevitable, we need to accelerate it. Well, when you take send out people's jobs overseas, not only do you get people that become more inclined to accept what you will call socialist policy domestically, but they also start killing themselves at a higher rate. They also become depressed at a higher rate. I guess
the opioid crisis is a really good example of that.
Those are real things that are happening. There is a correlation between offshoring blue collar jobs and an opioid crisis among particularly men who are and not just the opioid crisis. That's at a historic high. Depression is at a historic high, and suicide are at historic highs. And those things are all related to people not feeling like there's no hope for the future because their jobs have been exported, and they've been told to suck it up, go to night school, learn to do something else.
Birth rates down,
right?
The communities are breaking apart,
and so we
It's all related to that. When you take a man's ability to earn his own living, you take the bread from his mouth, you're not going to get good results.
No.
I guess. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say if you take somebody's ability to produce an independent living, I mean, you reduce him to like a child or a slave, basically.
A subject of the state. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I guess that before we wrap this up, I think that should be something that we all set out to do now more than ever, because Trump is like scrambled politics, and it kind of gives us an opportunity to demand something different, right? Is to go out and change the way that we talk about trade and America First policy. Is like, listen, we can talk about this in petri dish Ben Shapiro theories of, facts don't care about your feelings and, cherry pick Ricardo, or we can say like, listen, people are not happy. People are literally turning to, Bernie Sanders socialism. They're turning to addiction. They're killing themselves. It's like, that's not an appeal to emotion. That's what's actually happening. So I think that's part of, I guess, changing the way we have this discussion.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for right now. So we wanted to thank you, Spencer, one more time for joining us. And if you want to go ahead and let our listeners know what other ways people can follow you, or what any social media you want to plug, or any other sites you write for.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me on the show. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Of course.
And if people want to keep up to date with what I'm doing, they can just visit my website, nationaleconomicseditorial.com. Mm-hmm. And they can also follow me on Twitter. It's like SP Morrison.
At SP.
Or something like that.
I was looking at your American Greatness profile. I think it's SP Morrison _. The underscore is very important.
Yes. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. All right. Well, we want to thank all of you guys for listening. This was a great episode, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.